By the way, that horrible sound, I don't know what it is. It happens. Well, yeah, it's a very chill fire alarm, if that's what it is. All right. All right. Turn your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. All right. Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. We're talking about Jesus himself, talking about who he is, what he's like, what he's done, and this week we're talking about the resurrection. What?
Proof for existence.
We're talking about evidence, proof for Jesus, for his resurrection. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. All right. So this week is going to be a little different. Most weeks we go through a text of Scripture, explain what it means and how it applies to our lives. This week we're taking a step back and saying, okay, what is the most important thing of Christianity? Do you guys remember? The most important thing. Most important thing about our faith. Jesus rose from the dead. Exactly. The most important thing. Paul says right here, in fact, 1 Corinthians 15, 14, and 19. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sin. So the point that we've been making last week, and really throughout the last few weeks, is our whole faith depends on this historical event actually being true. So here's what we're going to do today. Today, we're going to step back for a moment and say, can we prove this historically? Can we prove from real history, not just what we happen to believe as Christians, can we prove that this actually happened in real history? Can we prove it like the fall of Rome? Can we prove it like the existence of Alexander the Great? Can we prove it like George Washington crossing the Delaware? Can we actually prove it as a real historical event? Today I'm going to use an approach, if you guys want to learn more about this when you're studying evidence for Jesus' resurrection, it's called the minimal facts approach to proving the resurrection of Jesus. You don't have to know that, but if you really want to go deeper, that's what it's called. And here's how this approach goes. Can we prove that Jesus rose from the dead only using things that 95% or more of historians agree happens? So we're talking atheists, agnostics, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, all the historians. Well over 95% of them agree these things actually happened. And then from those things that happened, can we prove that Jesus rose from the dead? So there are a few of these facts that we can use and then conclude from these that Jesus rose from the dead, all right? Here's the fact number one that well over 99.9% of historians agree was real. Number one, Jesus existed. If you've ever heard this idea that Jesus didn't exist, he was some made-up thing, made-up story that Christians made up later on, that is just absolute nonsense. How many of you guys knew who Bart Ehrman is? Anyone know that? Bart Ehrman? So Bart Ehrman, he's a professor in North Carolina, so like 3 hours north of us, right? Where the college is. He's a professor over there. He just retired. He is one of the most infamous anti-Christians out there, like atheist, Christianity's stupid, like it wrong, like that sort of a person, right? Infamous. And he is also he has debated Christians against Jesus' resurrection, all kinds of stuff, against the existence of God, like all that. And even here, let's look at this quote from Bart Ehrman about the existence of Jesus. So he's talking to a group of atheists here, and he says this, listen. Atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism. So mythicism is the belief that Jesus did not exist. He's a myth, that's what they claim. Because frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's you're going to believe, you just look foolish. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field that Jesus existed. All right? There are well over 20 early sources that speak of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Right? But for comparison, the only figure in ancient history who had comparable sources talking about him was the emperor of Jesus' time. In fact, Jesus has more sources talking about him than even the Roman Empire of his time. So this guy from this little town in Nazareth versus the Roman Empire, right? The emperor of this whole massive country. And Jesus has more sources attesting for him. That's why even the most respected atheist scholars of the day are like, yeah, if you don't believe Jesus existed, like, you are outside of reality here. So fact number one, we won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but we know, all the scholars are in agreement here, Jesus really existed. But we know a few things about this Jesus. Historical fact number two, Jesus died by crucifixion. John Dominic Crossan is another one of those scholars right here who was a part of this movement called the Jesus Seminar, and their whole point was to take a look at the Bible and highlight parts that they think were really good and highlight parts that they think were bad or should not be in the Bible, right? So like they're not Christians by any means. He's a part of this messed up group here, but here's what even he says about Jesus' death by crucifixion. There is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. That he was crucified can be as sure as anything historical can ever be. As anything historical. Second quote here is from a woman named Paula Fredrickson. She says this, "The single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion." She's a Jewish historian, so not a Christian by any means. This is common knowledge among historians. Jesus not only existed, but he died by crucifixion. Now, why would someone believe that Jesus died by crucifixion? Well, first of all, this is attested by numerous sources, and we'll get into some of those sources later. But secondly, a crucifixion was not something that people could genuinely survive. This is something so brutal and horrific that the term excruciating comes from crucifixion. It means from the cross. In fact, the idea is the crucifixion was so horrible and painful, they had to come up with a new word to describe how terrible it was. This wasn't some lethal injection situation. This was horrible. Here's how the Journal of the American Medical Association, a prestigious academic journal, describes the events of crucifixion, what Jesus went through. They say this, "As the Roman soldiers repeatedly struck the victim's back with full force, the iron balls would cause deep contusions, and leather thongs and sheep bones would cut into the skin and subterraneous tissues. Thank you. The lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh." This was the scourging right before crucifixion. What would happen with the crucifixion? A guy who passed away in 2017, one of my favorite authors, describes and tells us, okay, after this horrible stuff happened, what happened on the actual cross? Here's what he says. "The cross was intended for brutality, and victims were not treated gently. On account of the way that crucifixion victims were made to hang, their rib cages were fully expanded, and their lungs could not generate the pressure necessary to exhale. In order to breathe out, they had to push up against the nail in their feet, and they could inhale as they sank back down. Once they had reached the limit of sheer exhaustion or blood loss, their bodies would sink down, and they would no longer be able to breathe out, and they would die of asphyxiation." So get this idea here. Scourged to the bone with metal balls, think cat of nine tails, but worse here, ripping apart like organs and things flying out and stuff, and that right there, then you're hung on a splintery wooden cross and forced just to breathe, to scrape that bloodied back up and down to the point where you die from either losing blood, organ failure, or you just can't breathe anymore and you die. That's what Jesus went through. And believe it or not, this is the PG version of describing what happened here. The idea that someone could survive this it's just not literally possible. Even with modern medicine, this would be extremely difficult to deal with, to be able to revive someone for something like this. In the first century, simply impossible. So understand, it is undeniable historically that Jesus died by crucifixion. So Jesus existed. Jesus died by crucifixion. That's why well over 95% of historical scholars agree this happened. Atheist, Christian, whoever. Historical fact number 3. Jesus was seen alive after the fact. This may surprise you. The vast majority of historical scholars agree the disciples, the witnesses, the Apostle Paul, who was an enemy of Jesus, James, who didn't believe in Jesus during his life, they saw something that they genuinely thought was Jesus. Now, the atheists would say that it wasn't really Jesus, but they genuinely believed it. That's what they believe here. Here's Gerd Ludemann, who's one of the most prominent atheists who denies the resurrection, says this. "It may be taken as historically certain that the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. He doesn't believe Jesus actually rose from the dead, but what he's saying is they genuinely saw something and they thought it was Jesus. Bart Ehrman again says this, there can be no doubt historically that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he was raised from the dead. No doubt whatsoever. This is how Christianity started. So here are 3 facts here. Number 1, Jesus existed. Number 2, Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus was actually seen alive afterwards. How do we know Jesus was actually seen alive afterwards? Well, number 1, a large group of the people who claimed to see Jesus were willing to die for the belief that they're proclaiming that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Now, here's a good saying for you to keep in mind. Liars make poor martyrs. Here's the reality. No one is going to purposely lie and die for that lie if they know it is false. Now, people will die for things that they think are true but are actually false. For example, the people that went to crash into the World Trade Center at 9/11, right? 2001, a few years before you guys were born, most of you. Those people genuinely believed that Allah would reward them for their terrorism. But they died for a lie. But if they knew that they would go to hell and they were lying about this, they wouldn't have died for it. You don't die for something that you know is false. And it's undeniable that they genuinely believe this. So, here's the question. How do you explain these 3 facts? These 3 facts, virtually every historical scholar agrees happens. So how do we explain it? Christians would say that the best explanation for these facts is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. But let's go through all the different theories, the different possibilities that people have put forth. Maybe it was something else. Let's talk about it. Number 1, maybe it was a great big conspiracy. Maybe all these people who claim to see Jesus alive after the fact, maybe these people were all in on this big conspiracy to deceive the world. You just got to think about this. Like imagine like you have Peter, James, and John, right? They're in a fishing boat and they're like, man, Jesus had just died. They're like, wow, it really stinks that Jesus died. They're like, yeah, that really does stink, And then Peter says, hey, I got it. I got an idea. What if we went and we told everybody that he rose from the dead and all's gone according to plan? What if we told them that? And James is like, okay. Well, if we did that, what would happen? What would be the result? Like, well, we'd probably be killed, murdered. All our families would probably be like torn apart, or we would lose all our stuff and all those things. Like, okay. Would we get rich off of it? Like, well, no, because all the rich and famous people already oppose this. Or, well, would we get power out of it? Like, well, no, because all the rich and famous and powerful people already oppose this and killed him for it. Like, well, would we at least have the moral satisfaction of leading people to eternal life? Well, no, because we know it's a lie and people don't go to heaven for believing a lie, so no. All right, I'm in, let's do it. And then off they go, and they're like, all right, we're just going to go the lions, and we're just going to get killed, and we're going to basically be winking at each other saying, stick to the story. It's all going to work out in the end. Now, let me ask you, does that seem compelling to you?
The only way you could describe someone fully doing that and thinking that is if they had some very strong hallucinogens.
We'll talk about that in a second. But to genuinely believe it's false and to proclaim it anyway, even to your death. By the way, we don't have historical for sure that all the disciples died, but for at least a few of them, we have very strong evidence that they went to their death for these beliefs. And the others, we don't have any evidence that they didn't. It's very clear that they genuinely believe this. They could not have been lying for this. Well, then that's the second one. What if they had all hallucinated? That's what you brought up right here. What if they all genuinely thought it, but because of their deep grief, they saw like images of Jesus and they're like, wow, he must have come back from the dead, and they start proclaiming it, thinking that he rose from the dead. That's the other theory. Now, how do we know this didn't happen? Well, number 1, this theory is usually thrown out by people who have not studied academically hallucinations. It's people who don't know anything about it. When you actually look at the science of hallucinations, did you know that hallucinations, first of all, are almost always just sound or just a brief visual and then it's gone? Very short and one mode, either just auditory or just visual, almost never both, and almost never for a longer period of time. They're incredibly rare, even in those short circumstances. And when they do happen for longer, it's like unbelievably rare. And what we have to say is that not just one person, but 2, 3, 4, 12 people hallucinated. And then you had Saul, who was an enemy of Christ, would have no reason, no grief to hallucinate, suddenly starts hallucinating about this thing. And then this other guy starts hallucinating. And then this happens over here. And then these 500 people start hallucinating. All these people start hallucinating. And all their hallucinations match up perfectly. And these hallucinations leave things like food that has been eaten. And there's an empty plate. And like, oh, how'd that happen? Well, we all saw the guy eat from it. Like, does that seem compelling to you? Like, hallucinations, like dreams, are by nature personal. Imagine if, like, I woke up, imagine if I was having a dream tonight, right? I went to sleep, had to start having a dream, and Sarah and I were just like chilling over in Hawaii and having, grape juice or whatever, because, not alcohol, because it's a church, right? So we're going over, we're just like kind of chilling, our feet are up, and Dolph was just kind of hanging out. It's this great thing, and I wake up, and I'm like, wow. And I say, hey, Sarah, here, let's share this dream. Let's go back and we'll have like a free vacation over to Hawaii, right? Imagine if that happened. Would that be possible for her to share my dream? No. Dreams are by nature personal. They're internal. We can't share hallucinations. That's not how that works. The closest thing, a quote-unquote group hallucination, is when we see some short thing out of the corner of our eye. We're like, oh, did you see that? Yeah, I saw that. That's completely different from, hey, y'all, let's have a 20-minute conversation with this guy and all share exactly the same views, the same account of exactly what happened. And then this guy over here said the same thing over here that he heard this guy, and it's all lining up perfectly. And the final nail in the coffin here is it's really suspect. Imagine if we're over at the bank over here, United Community, right? We're at the bank. And I walk in, y'all are, like 5 of you guys are there, right? And I'm like, I got a gun. Give me the money, and I start robbing the bank, right? And then I get a bunch of money, and then I leave off. And then I show up next Sunday, and you're like, yo, you robbed the bank. I'm like, no. Every single one of you guys just hallucinated seeing me do it.
That's manipulation.
Would you believe me? No, right? That's what we're saying here. Like, oh, we have no reason to think that they had anything to do with hallucinations, except I don't want to believe what they're saying is true. So no. Hallucinations is not a valid view of what happened to the resurrection. Well, maybe Jesus wasn't really the one to die on the cross. Maybe that someone switched with him so that person died, and then Jesus kind of came back later, hey guys, I rose from the dead, but someone else was killed. Maybe that's what happened, right? Well, here's a problem with that. First, according to the vast majority of scholars, Jesus died by crucifixion, not some other fake. But secondly, we run into the catch-22 of timing, right? So imagine this. Imagine like Jesus is over there. Before he gets whipped and like scourged, someone switches out with him. Now, there's no bleeding. There's nothing that makes him unrecognizable, so you see his face, right? Do you think that the people who are about to scourge this guy to death are going to be able to tell the difference between this guy and some other random dude off the street?
Probably.
Yeah. And if even just one of the disciples knew this, this collapses into the first one of a conspiracy, and we already have problems with that. So you have to say that Jesus somehow escaped, switched off, and somehow got out with these Roman guards who, if you look at history, if you let a prisoner go as a Roman guard, you would be killed. So these guys have a vested interest in not letting anyone go. So if it happens before scourging, you either got this collapsing to theory one, or you have a bunch of these Roman guards doing all this great stuff and everything for us for no good reason whatsoever. Yes?
Do any sources say what unit of Roman soldiers they were? Because it very much depends on if they would be able to get away with lying.
That's a good question.
The emperor at least 13 times.
Do what?
There is one unit of Roman soldiers who has killed at least 13 emperors.
Nice. Yeah, these guys would have been, typically, if I'm not mistaken, they just would have been part of a typical Roman guard for guarding a low-level important city.
Okay,
So
not the emperor's guard, so we don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, this wouldn't be like the emperor's imperial. Yeah, this would just be your low-level guys that just kind of like think like private, captain, like that sort of thing.
Yeah. No.
But that's a good question. I could always look into that more. But yes, this would be unreasonable for this to happen. But what if it happened after he was scourged to the bone, right? Let me ask you. Can you tell the difference between a person that's been scourged to the bone and some random dude off the street? Can you tell the difference there? Like, be like, oh, suddenly this guy doesn't have any injuries. This is a little weird. I guess we'll kill him. It's probably Jesus. Could you tell the difference?
Nonetheless, medicine wasn't good enough to make someone recover from that.
It's insane. So that there's no way it was the case with that he was switched afterwards. So the substitution theory fails. By the way, I don't have this on here, but the Muslim view here is that what happened was he was switched before the cross, but what happened was God superimposed Jesus' face onto some other figure like Judas, and he was killed instead, but it was on his face, right? To make people think that Jesus was killed when he wasn't really. Number one, that's a miracle, and you have no reason to think that miracle happened. So if you have a reason, like the resurrection, then okay, like him predicting it, then yeah, well, we could believe that. Number one, there's no reason. But beside that, here's what this would make happen. If God somehow did this, superimposed Jesus' face on Judas or whatever, and made him killed, God would be the reason why the vast majority of, like, Christianity is the world's most popular religion. And if God did that, he would be the reason why the vast majority of what Christians are Christians and not Muslim. If God truly did this, and Islam were true, like the Muslims say, God would be the source of the number one top false religion in the world. It doesn't make any sense.
That plan's about as dumb as a bomb builder.
It really is. So substitution, whether naturally or supernaturally, does not make any logical sense. So this theory fails. Here's another one that's kind of crazy. What if Jesus secretly had an identical twin brother who died?
Makes sense.
You can see the chuckling right here, right?
No.
Here's the idea that either Jesus' twin brother died. Let's say Jesus dies. This twin brother comes out of hiding and is like, hey guys, I'm Jesus, resurrected from the dead. And then he goes off and lives in France somewhere or something like that, right? That's the view. Here's what you'd have to believe with this. Excuse me. You would have to believe that this twin brother was not known by any of the disciples. So he was hidden for 30 years of his life. Otherwise, this falls into the conspiracy theory, the first one. You'd also have to believe that he was switched at birth. Because if he wasn't switched at birth, you think Mary would know she had twins? Do you think she would know? And Mary, who's close with these disciples, who would tell them, hey, this thing happened, would be able to tell what's going on right here? You think she'd be able to kind of communicate what's going on with this? So she would have to not know. So that means that Jesus would have to be switched at birth 30 years before any kind of ministry and anyone would know that he'd be crucified. He'd have to be in hiding this whole time just for this moment that there would have no way of knowing what happened, just to play a big practical joke. He'd have to be smart enough to be able to pull this deception off and dumb enough to do it when the person who looks just like him was killed. If I'm a Roman and I see this guy walking around who I just killed, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to finish the job. Or you have to believe that Mary was in on it and she randomly hid this guy for 30 years just to pull off a trick that she wouldn't know that Jesus was going to die. For what reason? So that one of her sons could die and another son could start a religion that's not going to help her in any way and she's going to get persecuted. Like, it doesn't make any sort of sense. It fails.
So they're thinking Monty Python's The Life of Brian was the first party source.
That's how crazy this sort of stuff is. What about theory number 5? What if Jesus rose from the dead naturally? It just nothing supernatural. God didn't do it. It just happened, right? You know this stuff happens sometimes. Someone's like, they're dead and then they're not, right? I've seen, now what they'll point to is things like someone's heart stops beating, then it starts up again, right? They're like, see, it happens in modern life and then maybe it can happen with Jesus. Here's the problem. There's a difference between your heart stops and a few minutes later it comes back and you've been shredded to the bone. You've died, like multiple organs are like missing at this point. Like you've been stabbed and beaten, wounds and blood everywhere. And I mean, even if you somehow revived, you die again in a few minutes anyway because of all the blood loss and everything. Like you're in a fatal condition. It's absolutely crazy. Cells don't magically regenerate. The only way a real resurrection could happen would be if God intervened and did something not normal. So a normal natural resurrection does not work. Well, here's this view. What if we just can't know what happened, but there's no way it was a resurrection, but we just can't know, right? Let me ask you this. Suppose we had murdered, right? Suppose I was murdered. And suppose we saw right next to it was dropped a gun. And on that gun was Grayson's fingerprints. Sorry, Grayson. It's got Grayson's fingerprints, and it's got a note that says, hey, it was me, Grayson, I did it, right? So imagine this happened, right? And imagine we're looking at this and seeing this evidence, we're like, you know what? Wow. You know, there's no way we can know who really did this. All the evidence is pointing in this direction. No, there's no really way of knowing. I mean, who can know? I mean, it could have been forged. I mean, who knows? Right? Does that seem reasonable to you?
They threatened my family.
Right?
They threatened my family.
Is there, but if all the evidence is going in one direction, is there any reason to think this is the case? No. So to say, hey, listen, we got this evidence. Jesus died. We know that. People saw him afterwards. It's pointing in this direction. To say, we just can't know, that just means you're trying to avoid the conclusion. That leads us to the only remaining theory. It's that Jesus rose from the dead. It's the best explanation. We'll have time for questions. It's the best explanation for what we saw in history, in reality. This isn't to get, I have tons of stuff I don't have time to get into because we want to have time for some questions we're going to get into in just a moment. This isn't to include even reading all of the primary sources who talk about this guy, people claiming he's alive after the fact. This isn't to talk about the artifacts that we see that prove this is the type of crucifixion that happens. This isn't even to mention the artifacts we see, physical artifacts that we dug up from the ground that prove that they worship Jesus as God by the end of the first century, within the lifetime of the people after the disciples. This is early stuff. Why would people kind of come to these conclusions, Jesus is God, if this guy is dead and his body's over in the tomb next door? Now, we're going to have time for questions. So here's what we're going to do. All right, guys.
That's literally the conspiracy.
Yeah, well, that was asked before we answered that, so. All right. Ugh. So if you want to ask a question, scan that code. I'd encourage you to go to that link anyway, because you can like questions that are good, and you can downvote. You actually can't downvote, never mind. But you can like the ones you like and not like the ones you don't, right? By the way, if ever you're in the YouTube channel, if you like what was said, press the like button. If you don't like what was said, press the dislike button twice, okay? Just do that.
I've seen like shorts and that have like 1K view, but
Yeah.
they have like just 24 likes.
Yeah, it happens sometimes. All right. So how do we know they didn't lie but just coming back? We already talked about that. How does one come back from the dead without outside help? It's a good question. You can't. The fact of the matter is, the only way that Jesus could have actually come back from the dead is if the outside help of the God of the stinking universe caused it. You see, understand this. When we say that Jesus came back from the dead, or when you say dead, what do you think when you hear the word dead, right? What do you guys think?
Dead.
Gone? Not living? Passed away? Ceasing to exist? Right?
Actually, it's a biotic. Just that.
But let me ask you this. Do we cease to exist when we die? No. Do we cease to exist when we die? No.
At least, like, good naturally, a few years would want to decompose.
Our bodies, so here's the reality here. The word death, really, when it comes down to it, means separation. Physical death is the separation of our souls from our bodies. Spiritual death is separation of our souls from God. So when Jesus died, he did not cease to exist, but he was separate from his body. And so as God, he could cause himself to rise back from the dead, or he could have the Father raise him back from the dead. So yes, Jesus is able to do that. But if you had some person who thought that you can come back from the dead without that, that's that natural resurrection theory, and it doesn't make any kind of sense. It does not make sense logically. So why didn't we talk about Mary Magdalene? There really wasn't. So there are some conspiracy theories out there that say that Jesus. So there is a quote unquote lost gospel called the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, and it claims that Jesus got married to Mary Magdalene, and they went off and lived in France somewhere, right? But here's the reality here. Number one, the Gospel of Jesus' Wife was a 20th century forgery, and if I'm not mistaken, copied certain Greek texts from a PDF. This isn't an actual, we know where it came from. These quote-unquote lost gospels were always written hundreds of years after the true people, like Gospel of Thomas, Thomas was already dead by the time the Gospel of Thomas came out. The Gospel of Jesus' wife, 20th century. Like, this is like late stuff. This isn't stuff where like it could have been legit to reality. There is no good historical reason to think that Mary Magdalene was in on some conspiracy or anything to bring this about. What we do see is Mary Magdalene was one of the women that discovered Jesus' empty tomb. Now, I want you to kind of think about this. We didn't have time to work into this, but this is actually something to consider here, right? During the time of Jesus and the apostles, the testimony of women was not regarded. A lot of men thought women are just too emotional, and were like, they're not going to be good people, good witnesses in court. So they did not take the witness of women seriously. All right? But here's what this means. Imagine if you're making up a story, okay, about Jesus coming back from the dead. You're making the story up. And if women's testimony are not reliable, are you going to make up that women were the first ones to see Jesus' empty tomb? Are you going to make that up? No, you're going to use men like Peter or like the big guys, they saw it, right? Or maybe the Pharisees or maybe the emperor. So if you're going to make something up, you're not going to use people who you think are unreliable witnesses. But here's what we know. Women are not unreliable witnesses. The only reason they would have included women there, who they thought were unreliable, as the witnesses of the empty tomb, would be if they thought it actually happened. And they're just like, this kind of stinks for us, but this is what we got. So in other words, the cultural sexism of that day is actually evidence that the women actually really in reality discovered the empty tomb, which is pretty cool. So yeah, that Mary Magdalene is one of those witnesses. All right, what we got here? Why does any of this evidence actually matter if there's not the foundation of faith? That's a good question. So faith, what is faith? Do you guys know what the word faith means? Trust, absolutely. Yes, faith means trust. It's very easy for us as Christians to misunderstand the role of faith. A lot of people think that faith is a way of knowing truths. We know this because of faith. Faith is not a way of knowing truths. Faith is a response to the truths that we know. This is very important here. We don't know that gravity is true because of faith. But we have faith that we're not going to fly off into the universe because of gravity. I don't know Sarah's trustworthy because of faith in her. I have faith in her because she is trustworthy, and she has shown herself trustworthy. Evidence gives us good reasons to have faith. Does that make sense? Faith is not the foundation of knowledge. Faith is the foundation of our relationship that we have with Jesus because of the evidence. Does that kind of make sense? Cool. All right. How can we incorporate this into our lives? Good question. So here's the reality here. What Paul said, if our faith, here's what this means. If someone comes up to you and says, yeah, I don't believe in Jesus and all this garbage stuff, I believe in science. You can say, well, hey, listen, this is actually true historically. Do you believe in historical evidence? Do you believe in the real world? You can use this in evangelism with atheists. You can use this with people who don't believe that Christianity is reasonable, who think you're stupid for being a Christian. That's how it can apply to your life. But here's another thing. This is actually a big, important one. How many of you, I'm raising my hand because I'm part of this, have struggled with doubt before? How do I know this actually is legit right here? Right? I have felt that way. In fact, I've once said this before, that when I wake up in the morning, okay, I think you would actually, but I've said this before.
I don't want to delete that.
All right, just put a thumbs up so that can go on the top. But what's it called? When we're struggling with doubt, there have been times when I've waken up basically an atheist because I'm grumpy and I have my first cup of coffee, and then I'm an agnostic and I have a second, and then I'm a Christian again, right? Here's the reality. There are two different types of doubts. There are emotional doubts that have nothing to do with the evidence, and there are evidence doubts. Evidence, because we're like, I wonder if this is even true. What this does is actually helps us with both. When we're struggling with the evidence, we can look at the evidence and be like, yeah, we're good with this. But even when we're struggling emotionally, when we're like, suffering's happening, when a family member is dying, and we're like, how can I know this is even true? We can cling to this and say, okay, I know I'm not going to go to hell because I'm believing some wrong thing. I don't have to worry about this and this struggle because I know this is actually happening in reality. It helps us to persevere when we're struggling through things. Does that make sense? Every once in a while when I wonder, like, gee, what if Islam's true or Judaism or whatever, like, that's would sting for me. I can be like, okay, but I know this is true. I have a lot of evidence for this, and it gives me comfort. So that's what I would say with that. All right. Super nerd. Fair enough. All right. Any other questions? You can either ask like this. Y'all are something else. I'll have to ask Randy. All right. Do we have any other questions? We can either put it up here or not, or we can end early. Trent is okay. It's turning into a group text. What is going?
Never made it as a wise man.
Legally. All right.
Whoa, guys.
All right. So first, legally, is the Bible correct? So we're going to be getting into evidence. What? So we're going to be getting into evidence for the historical reliability of the Bible later on. So we'll talk about that, but I'll just say, summarize, yes, according to legal standards, the Bible is correct, but we can talk about that later. All right. How do you answer a person who says that they won't worship a God who is worshipped by bad people? People, for example, who have claimed to be Christians.
How do I expand it?
I don't know if it can be expanded. But yeah, I know, kind of get the idea. I've heard this before. Who claim to be Christians but are like just really mean and like horrible. Like, for example, if someone's like, hey, I'm a Christian and I'm going to go shoot up this whole school. Right? Like, sorry, too soon? No.
Persecuted people group.
Right, so like, I mean, yeah, so like, too soon, buddy.
Say that with total joy.
Yeah, so like, yeah, what do you do with this? So this is called the problem of hypocrisy. So the idea is Christians are hypocrites, therefore Christianity is not true. Now, a couple things. Number one, this is very emotionally impactful here. This is something that can really like affect us deeply. Because think about this. If someone's like, hey, I'm for the science club, and everyone in the science club is a complete jerk to you, are you going to want to join the science club? No. So it can really affect, that should show us, hey, listen, don't be a hypocrite. When you're going out and talking to people, don't be like, hey, you love Jesus, and the next day you're like beating on some kid in the hallway or whatever, or just like bullying someone. Like, no. Because it does affect people. It does affect people. Having said that, let me ask you a question. If someone plays Mozart badly, do you blame that person or Mozart? Right. If someone plays Jesus badly, do you blame Jesus or that individual person? The fact of the matter is, Christians who behave poorly, that doesn't change what Jesus actually taught. When you look at what Jesus actually taught, he says, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. He says, you will be known by your love for one another. Here's an interesting fact here. We'll get to this next one here. But here's an interesting fact, okay? Did you know that people who call themselves Christians, let's be mature guys, people who call themselves Christians, but are kind of in church a little bit, not really some, they kind of are, kind of not, and kind of in there, those people are something close to twice as likely as your normal, average, everyday person, including atheists, agnostics, twice as likely to be abusive, to sexually abuse children, and do a bunch of other horrible things. People who call themselves Christians, but are kind of on the fringes. But here's the reality. People who are devoted Christians are about half as likely as your normal population. So your atheists are kind of here, nominal Christians are here, and then devoted Christians are here. It's very interesting. And people are trying to figure out why. Why are the nominal Christians even worse than the atheists? And the reason is simply this. When you take your own selfish, evil, depraved desires, and you put a divine excuse on it, you start to do some pretty messed up stuff. Something to keep in mind here. As a Christian, you have on you the name of Christ. Christ in, Christian. Do not bear it in vain. Yeah. It's a good question. It depends on the music. So for example, the Harry Potter soundtrack, not made by a Christian, it's just music. Soundtrack, a song of half the song is about beating up women, Probably not, right? It depends. It's not so much the source, it's more so what is it teaching. Here's a good principle I like to go by. Would you feel comfortable putting the lyrics up on the screen saying, I stand by that? So basically, would you feel comfortable if we put the lyrics on screen? Would you be like, yep, I'm cool with it. I'll listen to that. If the answer is yes, you're good. Doesn't matter if it's Christian or not. If the answer is no, probably shouldn't listen to it. So, and I have some Christian music I listen to, some non-Christian music I listen to, but I try to keep it by that standard. Because here's my standard. I do that, and it's got to sound good. A lot of Christian music does not sound good. It's super annoying. So you got to find that sweet spot where it's good Christian music or not horrible non-Christian music. It's kind of that middle spot. Makes sense? All right. We have 3 minutes left. So any other questions, thoughts can be about, now we can bring it to anything before we, within reason, Silas, within reason.
So what if instead of a hallucination, what if all the disciples were high?
Okay. So that still doesn't number one, we have no reason to think historically that they were used drugs, and they were from a Jewish culture which would not have allowed that. Number two,
They didn't know what drugs were.
so they all happened to, at the same time, take all of these things.
Hallucinations still work the same way, even under
Hallucinogenic.
Right.
It happens the same way. So even if they all had actually been high and had hallucinations from being high, hallucinations still work the same way as they do in any other matter that hallucinations ever happen.
Right.
That they're very personal, that you're likely not all going to see the same thing. And we have historical evidence of that happening, like large amounts of people going on LSD trips together, and they're all seeing different things, feeling different things. It's highly, highly, highly unlikely that they all would have seen the same thing.
Right, and even if they all saw Jesus, they'd see him doing different things, saying different things, and it'd be multiple places, multiple different people, different groups of people, some the same, some different, including the apostles, including Paul, who was Saul at the time, who was persecuting Christians, who was no motive to do these things, to seek this. James, who, here's the thing. James, Jesus' brother. What would it take you to believe that your brother was the Son of God? This guy literally thought he was crazy during his life. Your crazy brother, who's like the loopy one, what would it take you to think that he's the Son of God and then God himself? I don't know, maybe him coming back from the dead and appearing to you? Yes?
Even then, if I'm not mistaken, most drug trips don't make you see a full man talking, walking, everything that would constitute life. You just see not that.
Mostly colors and shapes and stuff. And I will say, there have been cases. Yeah, right. There have been cases where people have. There have been cases where people have seen some pretty intense, weird stuff and everything on LSD. There's a certain drug. The street name is magic mushrooms.
Salvia is another one that comes.
But all this stuff, and where you can actually see weird stuff and everything. But again, you still run into the problem. Even if it's super complex, everyone's seen the exact same thing, and it's trust me, y'all, you didn't see me rob the bank. It just y'all were every single witness was hallucinating. It doesn't make sense. All right. Jeremy is a goofy goober.
Who wrote that?
Amen. I was just reading. I wasn't saying, All right. It's meant to be anonymous. All right.
Good question, guys, for the most part.
Yeah, for the most part. All right. I love Jesus. Me too. All right. We'll leave it on that. Let's pray. If you have any other questions, feel free to come and talk to me. Let me just say this before we close here. This right here is a teenified version, if that's a good word, of what we just went through this lesson. It's a tract. It's like a little trifold tract. And this is a beefier version, goes into more detail than we went through today. All right? So this beefy version goes into all the evidence I talked about, plus more, if you want to go really deep into the resurrection, right? And more importantly, it has a bunch of these things called sources in the back, which you can read those if you want to go into super academic stuff. But they're all free. You can have some at that little table over there by the food, okay? All right. So with that, Bruce, would you pray for us to pray us out?